Hello, and welcome to the latest installment of Law & Order, the video series where I look at and unpack stories from games. In this one, we'll be looking at Bloober Team's ambitious dual reality horror title, The Medium. This game showcased a pretty unique concept, which was a beautiful representation of a parallel world. Great visuals and an intriguing story, along with creepy monsters, kept me gripped throughout. If you want to play this game for yourself, then please be warned that there will be story spoilers in this video. But with that being said, let's get into it. The setting is post-communist Krakow, Poland in 1999. A young lady called Marianne watches the rain from her apartment. She shared the apartment with her foster father Jack Orkan, a funeral director. I say shared as Jack passed away 3 days prior, leaving the funeral home under the care of Marianne, along with leaving her to carry out the arrangements for Jack's funeral. Recently, Marianne has been having a vivid repeated dream of a young girl running through a forest and being shot by a man near a lake. Marianne needs to find Jack's tie clip. You see, Marianne has certain unique abilities. She is a medium and possesses the ability to see things that other people wouldn't. She uses this insight to find the tie clip. She also uses this ability to help troubled and trapped souls find peace. After leaving the apartment, she leaves to prepare Jack for his departure. Marianne places the tie clip onto Jack and then the lights flicker. A creepy shadow figure stands at the top of the stairs, and after going to the office, we see the extent of what Marianne is able to do. She is able to see in both the material world and the spiritual mirror of it. Going into the office, it's been trashed. She enters into the parallel world and finds Jack searching his office for his notebook and says that he's going to be late. He's wearing a death mask and has a massive hole in his head. He seems to think that he has a lot of work to do, and it seems that Jack hasn't really come to terms with the fact that he is in fact dead. Despite this, Jack appears to find some peace and manages to pass on. Marianne is distraught, but also relieved that Jack has managed to find his peace, but she breaks down crying. But then, a mysterious phone call from someone who claims to know her.
We're closed. There's another funeral home across town. I can give you the number.
Marianne.
Who is this?
You don't know me, Marianne, but I know you.
Look, if this is a joke...
You need to listen to me, Marianne.
Okay, I'm hanging up.
I know what you are.
What? Who is this?
My name is Thomas. I need your help.
Listen, if that's all you've got, I'm...
No, there's more. I can give you the answers you've been looking for your whole life. But I need you to trust me.
Trust you? I don't even know you.
It all starts with a dead girl.
What did you say?
The NIWA Resort. Find me there. Please. The light, it's almost gone. It's not dark yet, but it's getting there. You're the only one who can stop it. You're my only chance.
Hello? Hello? Shit.
Marianne jumps on her motorbike and travels to a former government-funded vacation resort called the NIWA Workers Resort. Arriving at the gates, Marianne notes that something about the resort feels off. She sees the figure of a man, and after entering into the resort, she goes in search of the man, assuming him to be Thomas. A short time into her journey through the forest, Marianne sees a child's ball, a toy rolling towards her. Marianne uses her insight and sees what appear to be a child's footsteps leading somewhere. She comes across some ruins, and she again manages to see both the material and spiritual realms. Marianne senses the place as being old and soaked in misery, indicating that this could have been somewhere where death was present. A lot. Marianne manages to use spirit energy to affect the material world, empowering up a gate to pass through, and it's not long before the footsteps lead Marianne to the NIWA Hotel. It's derelict and run down, and has a very strong and negative spiritual energy or an aura attached to it, as Marianne soon finds out.
What the hell are you, NIWA?
She enters the hotel and sees the leftover remnants of the NIWA massacre, bloody clothes and belongings with spiritual echoes attached to them, which give Marianne an insight into moments experienced by the person that item belonged to. Exploring the ground floor of the hotel in search of Thomas, Marianne finds a locked gate and someone or something is ringing the bell on the front desk, but no one is there. Marianne investigates and encounters a young girl. The girl introduces herself as Sadness. Sadness says that she used to have a lot of friends there at NIWA, but that they're all gone now. Sadness agrees to help Marianne find Thomas and tells Marianne to meet her on the second floor. Naturally, the elevator breaks down on the first floor, so Marianne has to find her way up. She uses an out-of-body experience in the spiritual in order to explore beyond physical reality. She also encounters fleshy barriers and moths, which seem to harm Marianne, forcing her to use a spirit shield to fight them off. Seeing memories of former guests of the resort along the way, Marianne reaches the second floor and finds the office of Thomas Rekowicz, the NIWA's manager. Sadness shows up and mentions an old man who was at the hotel recently, but that she's not sure if it was Thomas or not. She tells Marianne that they shouldn't go into the office, but Marianne goes in anyway. She discovers a secret room behind Thomas's office, which is essentially a storage room and a dark room for developing photos. To Marianne's surprise, she finds a photo and develops it, and it's a picture of herself. A slide projector turns on and it's more pictures of Marianne. Now in the spiritual world, she turns around to find something in the room with her. It's a malevolent spirit called the Moor. The Moor then grabs Marianne, but she manages to use her powers to harm the creature, and it drops her. The grotesque being chases after Marianne, and she discovers the Moor is scared of light. A tense game of cat and mouse ensues as Marianne has to be quiet and sneak around the entity. She's free of it, but a swarm of moths end up knocking her down to the floor below, and she passes out. She comes to a short while later and Sadness communicates with her via an old radio. She tells her to find Richard in the day room. In classic style, the door to the daycare is chained shut. Marianne needs to find a way inside. Sadness appears to be guiding Marianne to an area featuring an empty pool. It's clear from the walls that part of the NIWA massacre took place here too. Marianne eventually sees some bolt cutters, but they are for now unreachable, and she sees Sadness beckoning to her from the other side of a mirror. Sadness has Marianne follow a spirit trail, and it leads her to various memories prior to the massacre at NIWA. Marianne essentially learns that Sadness was bullied by some kids at the resort. They thought of her as some sort of weirdo who talked to herself. Some girls wanted to mess with her, but a young boy, Bernard, protested against it. Anyway, Marianne is led to a locker which contains the white statue of a cat called Snowdrop. Going back to the mirror, Marianne figures out that the cat statue has a lot more to it. With it in her possession, she's able to use it to switch to the spiritual world through the mirror. She explores and finds a body that needs help moving on, so to speak. She needs to unite the body with their death mask in order to do so. The body belongs to Bernard, a boy who died in the NIWA massacre. She reunites him with his death mask, allowing him to find peace. He leaves behind the counterpart to the white cat statue, and this black cat allows Marianne to pass back to the spiritual world again. She is once again chased by the Moor, but it gets worse. The Moor has somehow found a way to exist between both worlds. Going back and forth between the two worlds again, Marianne finds two other victims of the massacre that are trapped there. One is called Victoria, who is a ballerina going by the stage name Vivienne. After finding out her identity and finding her mask, Marianne reunites her with it and gives her freedom. The other was a man named Nicholas, a man attending a conference at NIWA. With Nicholas getting set free, Marianne has the bolt cutters in reach, grabs them and uses them to enter the daycare. She has another conversation with Sadness. They talk about the creature that has been hunting and stalking Marianne. Sadness explains that it came from shame and helplessness, rage, like anger, but much more than anger, that once it got out, they couldn't stop it. Sadness explains that it ate all of her friends and that she is the only one left. But upon asking about Richard, Sadness says a bad thing happened to him, that he became hollow, became like a puppet. Then she remembers something. Sadness freaks out and says that she doesn't want to see him. Marianne explores the day room. What she finds greatly shocks her. Richard was an old man, an artist, and he held an art class there in the NIWA day room. He was a father figure to Thomas Rekowicz. We'll cover this in more detail later in the video, but essentially, he groomed and abused a young girl called Lilianne there at NIWA. The twist in the tale here is that Lilianne was Thomas's daughter. Another twist is that Lilianne is Sadness. Marianne eventually comes across a wheelchair that belonged to Richard. She sits in it and has a flashback. She sees Thomas frantically searching for something. He was also seemingly conversing with himself. However, it appeared that Thomas had similar abilities to Marianne. He is himself a medium, but his other self seems to be independent from his material self. After some help from his spiritual self, Thomas found Richard's diary, which revealed a highly disturbing obsession with Lilianne. Thomas was rightly furious and sat there waiting for Richard. His spiritual self said for him to give him time to do what he can do on that side, as too much is at stake, so earthly Thomas agrees to wait. One problem: Richard arrived and Thomas confronted him. Richard pleaded with Thomas and said that he has something inside him and that it wasn't him who did what he did. Thomas then attacked Richard.
You have to understand. There's a sting inside of me.
Shut up.
You have to believe me. I wanted to die.
I'll make it quick.
Thomas, I'm so sorry.
She's my daughter!
I never wanted any of this. I should never have come here.
But you did. Knowing she's here. Knowing what she means to me.
Thomas, I swear I'll go away. You'll never... Wait, what are you... No, let me out. Let me out.
Let me in.
Spirit Thomas was then in Richard's world. Richard had certain defences up, but Thomas eventually reached the family home that Richard shared with his mother and father. After a long journey through Richard's childhood memories full of loss and despair, Thomas reached the child version of Richard. Kept hostage by a grotesque entity called the Child Eater, Thomas freed young Richard from the tentacles that held him there. Thomas said to Richard that as long as he was there, that grotesque beast would always find him. Coming back around, Marianne, still in the wheelchair, is held there by the same tentacles from Richard's world. The Child Eater tells Marianne that Thomas is a beast who has been in hiding, hoping that they wouldn't find him. The Child Eater says that he is what's left of Richard. Then the Child Eater bizarrely tells Marianne that she smells like her being Lilianne. The monster tells Marianne that Thomas just left what was left of him there in the dark. The Child Eater forces Marianne to set it free by way of her being held there by its disgusting tentacles. Just before it leaves that spiritual realm, the Child Eater calls Marianne the girl from the red house. Then on the floor, Marianne sees a picture of herself there at NIWA. She also mentions that she can feel the red house out there somewhere, calling out to her from the woods. Leaving NIWA and walking through the forest, Marianne finds a furry friend and comes across its owner's camp. The owner is dead though, and a short while later, Marianne is once again being hunted by the Moor. This thing is extremely persistent. Marianne runs from the monster, being chased by it, and ends up finding refuge in the ruins of an old fort. Marianne then sees Jack, much to her surprise. It's clear the Moor is using Jack to taunt Marianne. Marianne then gains the upper hand and electrocutes the beast, incapacitating it. Leaving the ruins, Marianne discovers a swing, and on it is Lilianne. Marianne reassures her by telling her that she sent Richard away, that he's gone for good. Lilianne mentions her mother, who died, and Marianne explains that she also lost her parents too, in an accident, a fire, and she says that she's the only one who survived. Marianne offers to help Lilianne find peace, but she declines, saying that she can't leave yet. Marianne asks if Lilianne is scared of the monster. She replies that she is, but that the monster doesn't need her anymore, and that the Moor wants Marianne, and that when it finally puts her on, it'll be able to leave that place, but it'll never be satisfied and it'll never stop killing. Finally, she tells Marianne that she needs to remember the dream and the fire, and the red house. The same red house that Richard's grotesque spirit mentioned back at the NIWA hotel. Lilianne says that she was there with her during the fire, and Lilianne then leaves. Marianne searches the nearby garage and finds a lot of information about Thomas. Thomas did indeed seem to be on the run, in hiding, just as Richard said. She sees leftover spirit echoes showing a disgruntled gentleman burning down the house. Marianne then picks up a lighter and sees another flashback involving Thomas. He was in his garage one evening and broke into a briefcase containing a case file, some clothes, a gun, and also inside was the insignia of the Polish security service, the SB, the secret police. And then Thomas was attacked from behind by the government agent that the briefcase belonged to. Thomas was tied up and beaten by the agent. It appears that the SB had been searching for Thomas for a long time. They had experimented on him because they saw his powers and his room for potential should they be able to harness his powers. Then the war ended, and the Red Army took Thomas and they experimented on him too. He escaped and they'd been looking for him ever since. Anyway, the man started threatening Thomas's family. He knocked Thomas out. But then Thomas came to and saw that the man had become very desperate to know all about Thomas's power. So desperate that he set Thomas's home on fire with his family inside. But the man had made a critical error in taking his gloves off. Not knowing how Thomas's powers worked, he grabbed Thomas's neck, and their skin-on-skin contact allowed Thomas to infiltrate his mind just as he did with Richard. He entered into the man's mind. Thomas entered into a very cluttered world, like an office with filing cabinets and documents everywhere. Thomas states that he can take his time, as when he is exploring people's minds, time flows differently compared to in the material world. Throughout his time inside this man's mind, Spirit Thomas finds out that the man is someone called Henry Wilk. He had been assigned a case after what happened to Richard made its way to the authorities. Given that they knew about Thomas's powers, Wilk was sent to the NIWA Resort to investigate. More on Wilk's background story later, but anyway, Wilk's spirit was discovered by Richard to be represented as the Hound, another demonic entity. Not only this, but upon discovering the young Henry, it seemed that Henry was close with his demon. In fact, they were good friends. He didn't hate his demon like Richard did. Henry was even able to transfer himself fully into the Hound and essentially trap Thomas's spirit there by devouring it. Material Thomas was able to escape, however, but his spirit was still trapped. Thomas hit Henry with a wrench, and before Henry eventually passed on, he heard the voices of both Lilianne and her sister, Marianne. After that flashback, Marianne comes too, but Marianne is approached by something, the Hound. After some back and forth, Marianne acts.
I'm sending you where you belong! Henry!
Marianne needs to find out what happened after the fire. She finds out that her mother died during childbirth and that her sister Lilianne resented Marianne for it. But Marianne finds that Lilianne wasn't exactly alone inside her body.
I hate you. All of you. None of you know. None of you understand.
I do.
Certain objects inside the house also reveal Lilianne's inner turmoil during the fire.
But I can't leave her here. She'll die.
God. Remember, Mommy? It's all her fault.
No. She's my sister.
Then set me free, and I will save you both.
Lilianne then made a deal with them in order to save both herself and Marianne. The Moor was living inside Lilianne, and it bought its way out by saving them both from the fire. In the basement of the burned house, Marianne discovers that she entered into a coma and suffered amnesia, which is why she didn't remember any of what happened or her family. Lilianne then worried Thomas as she was talking of her not being alone during the fire, that the voice was there with her but that she didn't invite it.
Tell me about the fire, Lily. You were locked in, alone?
No. We were not alone.
No? Who else was there?
The voice. I didn't invite it, but it came anyway.
Then at some point, Thomas quarantined Lilianne. There's a very important reason as to why, but we'll cover that later on in the video. Marianne discovers a military-grade blast door leading to a fallout bunker attached to the basement. She enters. Hunted by the Moor once again, Marianne finds a shelter. The shelter where Thomas had quarantined Lilianne. Marianne pieces together a mirror, allowing her to see the other side, and finds Spirit Thomas there. He explains that the Moor was birthed out of Lilianne's tormented soul after suffering at the hands of Richard. As Lilianne was a powerful medium herself, Lilianne's powers grew and she had trouble controlling them, so he had to confine her to the bunker. But the Moor escaped and caused the NIWA massacre by possessing people at the resort. Wondering about her dream, she asks if Thomas would have shot Lilianne, but Spirit Thomas says that he couldn't have. Lilianne is actually still alive, and she is on the pier, exactly as seen in Marianne's recurring dream. Spirit Thomas says that he'll hold off the Moor for as long as he can, giving Marianne time to get to Lilianne. Marianne leaves the bunker, and the game's final scene plays out.
You finally made it.
Lilianne.
I've been waiting for you, little sister.
Lily, I didn't know. I couldn't remember. I'm so sorry.
It's okay. It was better that way. At least you had a life. For a while.
Lilianne.
That day when the fire broke out at our house, I made a deal. The part of my soul that was tormented was set loose.
You mean the monster? But why?
To save you. It helped us escape the flames, but in return, I had to set it free. Free to devour, to destroy, to kill.
The NIWA massacre.
Yes. All those people died so that we could live. And because I lived, so did my demons. Father knew my powers were too dangerous. He left you at the hospital so you could have a normal life.
And what about you? Did he try to...
No. Maybe he should have. But he couldn't bring himself to do it. Instead, he locked me away. But he only delayed the inevitable. Monster, it got out. And now you're here. You're the only one who can fix this. You. We both share our father's gifts, but also his fate. And the dream.
The dream? But... all I see is a girl. You. Shot dead. Here, on this pier. Hasn't it already happened?
No. It's not the past you see. The dream. It's what I want to happen.
What?
It all ends in me.
But... no! No!
You can't send a spirit away while the host is still alive. That's why you couldn't destroy the monster. That's why Sadness didn't want to go.
But... you're my sister.
That's why it has to be you. I'm not strong enough. It won't let me. Only you can end this. Only you can fix what our father could not.
Lilianne, I can't. Please, don't make me do this.
It's the only way to destroy it. to prevent further bloodshed.
Lily?
Marianne? What's going on?
Skin suit. Now too small. Constricting. Outgrown her. Don't need her. Suit. Light. Almost gone. Not dark yet. But it's getting there.
There is another way.
Marianne. No.
What is she doing? It changes nothing.
It's like you said. I'm your only chance. Aren't I? You need a medium strong enough to sustain you. The others? They only lasted for so long before you broke them down.
Marianne, please. I don't want
Maybe
this.
it's not your choice. Maybe this is my story after all.
No!
Don't do this!
Please, sister. Set me free.
No! Stay back! Stay back!
All has to be. It has to be you. He'll never stop killing.
You finish this.
Only you can end this.
You can't always save everyone. Butterfly.
So, from that, it's pretty unclear whether Marianne sacrificed herself or her sister, but it's assumed it's the former. In a post-credits scene, we see Thomas picking up a pocket watch after leaving the NIWA hotel, so it confirms that he's alive. And that's a basic version of the plot. But now we can get into unpacking certain parts of the story and make a bit more sense of what happened. We'll begin the meaty part of this video by discussing the location the majority of the game takes place in. The NIWA Resort was, according to a World War II memorial near the hotel, a significant landmark that was used in some function, although what that was is never actually explained. It's a hotbed of spiritual energy, likely due to the misery and death that surround it, what with the war and the NIWA massacre. A newspaper states that the nearby Fort Pulaski, the ruins near the start of the game, was destroyed in bombings by Hitler's forces, and it's very likely that the entire surrounding area got hit too. This probably explains why there are a lot of bodies in the spiritual version of this area, because many people likely died in these bombings. Anyway, along came Thomas Rekowicz, who renovated the site, and it was completed in 1969. Thomas then became the hotel manager. An inauguration ceremony was held in the summer of that same year, and the resort was officially opened as a government-funded resort. Thomas, who was a member of the Communist Polish United Workers' Party, was joined by the party's first secretary for the opening. Fort Pulaski was also due for renovation works to be carried out and completed by 1983, but clearly that didn't happen. Then, of course, the NIWA massacre happened. Some people escaped the massacre, but many legends were told, from crazed workers to ancient curses, the hotel would never reopen. Fun fact, the NIWA Hotel is actually itself based upon a real-life abandoned hotel in Poland called the Hotel Cracovia, which has been abandoned since 2011. So we'll now look at what happened to Thomas and why he was of such interest to both the Nazi and Red Army scientists in the first place. During the Second World War, when Thomas was 3 years old and living in Warsaw, his family was killed by the invading Nazis, but instead of killing him, they noticed he was different, and they captured him and used him for experimentation as they were interested in harnessing his power for their own ends. Now, when the Second World War finished, the Red Army, I guess you could say, liberated Thomas, but not really. They imprisoned him too, and experimented on him just as the Nazis did. When Thomas is exploring the mind realm of Henry, he discovers session notes, 3 in particular, which document what happened during this experimentation. In session 42, Thomas was noted to be manifesting strong supernatural powers, claiming that something or someone else was talking to him and showing him visions. The scientists deduced that he had developed a potential connection to the spiritual, and that this could have been established through a near-death experience, although the game doesn't tell us or confirm this to be the case. Further tests were carried out, and in session 43, an incident occurred. Just the same as what happened with Henry in Thomas's garage, one of the scientists came into skin-to-skin contact with Thomas. The scientist was hospitalized, and although he showed no sign of any brain trauma, the scientist was basically a vegetable at that point. This forced the scientists to halt their research. Then in session 44, Thomas was considered to be extremely dangerous, and restraining him was a must. At some point, Thomas escaped his captors and went on the run. The security service were actively searching for him, as they considered him 1, dangerous, and 2, an asset. Thomas eventually got a job working in a factory, and this is where he met Richard Tarkowski. Richard noticed that he thought Thomas was special, and he befriended him, over the years becoming a father figure to him. Richard would frequently talk to Thomas about his visions and abilities. Richard himself was an artist, a painter, and wanted Thomas to see the depth of his potential as an artist himself. Thomas's visions and his descriptions of what he could see inspired Richard's own artistic expressions. As Richard puts it, a bottomless well of inspiration. However, Thomas only saw their chats as a sort of therapy, rather than a mere method of artistic expression. Thomas recognized that Richard saw his visions as something beautiful, rather than something born out of madness. Thomas eventually took control of his inner demons and went on to study architecture. Then romance entered into Thomas's life. He met a woman who would later become his wife, who in the game at least is unnamed. However, from this etching on a tree in the forest, we can safely surmise that her name began with the letter K. Anyway, as Thomas devoted more of his time to his love interest, Richard became jealous of her. Richard liked her though, and due to Thomas being like the son he never had, he stepped aside. Thomas and his wife then had one child, Lilianne, and then a few years later, Thomas's wife fell pregnant again, this time with Marianne. Their joy and happiness were to be short-lived, however, as it is presumed that Thomas's wife died as a result of some complications from childbirth. At some point in time, Thomas was made the manager of the NIWA Hotel, and he used his architectural knowledge gained from his education to redesign large parts of the hotel. Richard pulled some strings, using his influence to get Thomas the necessary grants and funds needed for the renovation works. The NIWA Hotel became a very popular resort. It was around this time that Richard was fired from his job at the university. It's not really explained why exactly, but this note explains that he was considered to be a source of dangerous liberal ideas. He reached out to Thomas, and Thomas offered Richard a place to live at the NIWA Resort. So, with us having explained and looked at Thomas's background, we should now take a look at Richard. Okay, so when Spirit Thomas infiltrates Richard's mind world, we get a detailed glimpse into Richard's childhood. Richard's father was a soldier, and at some point when Richard was young, he got called away to fight in the war. Richard was depicted as having a strong and good relationship with his father. Before his father left, he gave Richard his lucky knife. Then a short time later, a letter would arrive which would change young Richard's life forever. His father had been killed in the war. Around this time, still very young, Richard befriended a young Jewish girl called Rose. He loved her and helped her hide from the authorities, and they would play in the hedge maze behind Richard's family home, and Richard would draw her. She gave Richard her Star of David pendant for safekeeping, and Richard would also bring her food and drink. Eventually, Richard's mother met another man and they got married. The man moved in with them, but a short while later he became physically abusive, not only to Richard's mother, but to Richard too. Richard then used his father's lucky knife to fend him off at one point. Richard's mother then became extremely desperate to get rid of Richard's stepfather. She tipped off the authorities that her husband was hiding Jewish people in their home illegally. He was labelled a collaborator and was executed. Not just that, but Rose was discovered, and she, along with her family, were executed as well. Naturally, Richard was devastated. He likely couldn't fathom and accept that his own mother was the reason that the girl he loved was killed. This trauma ended up shaping the anger and bitterness inside him. This experience, along with the abuse suffered at the hands of his stepfather, led to his tormented soul creating the entity known as the Child Eater, the grotesque monster that Thomas encounters inside Richard's mind world. Richard then goes on to become a painter and a fairly well-respected artist who is hiding a dark side to him. This leads to him working at the university and also builds up to the time he meets Thomas Rekowicz later in life. Now, when Richard moved to the NIWA Resort after being fired by the university, he ran an art class from the NIWA Hotel's day room, and of course, one of these children was Lilianne. In reality, Richard despised himself as seen through a bathroom echo.
You... I know you're there. Wish I had the strength to cut you out. You don't deserve to exist. You're nothing.
Richard became good friends with a nurse working there, a nurse called Ursula Roskovsky. She actually fell in love with Richard, but he didn't feel the same towards her. He ended up writing a letter to her, telling her that although he values her friendship, he couldn't bear the thought of breaking her heart. Richard describes himself as damaged. It's safe to say that Ursula didn't take it well at all, but more on Ursula later. Then, as we know, Richard groomed and abused Lilianne, and Thomas found out, beating Richard and infiltrating his mind. But remember I mentioned that Thomas's abilities left scientists in a vegetative state through skin-to-skin contact? Well, this also happened to Richard. The infiltration by Thomas left Richard in a wheelchair, and he required care from, you guessed it, Nurse Ursula. She herself was dumbfounded, and he too showed no sign of any brain trauma. She said that she looked into his eyes and it's almost like there's no one looking back. That's of course because all that remains inside him is the grotesque remains of his tortured soul. Alright, so Henry actually has a fairly interesting story. It's not exactly known how old Henry Wilk is, but as a child he didn't seem to have a super close relationship with his father, as seen through Spirit Thomas's journey through Henry's mind world. He was the son of a butcher, and sketches found by Thomas seem to suggest that Henry was being pushed by his father towards carrying on the family trade. Now, in July 1979, Henry became an agent for the security service. During this time, stamp rationing was introduced in communist Poland. Henry's father Jacob found himself at the centre of a meat scandal, wherein he and numerous accomplices were found guilty of stealing the best pieces of meat for themselves and replacing those pieces of meat with lesser ones. Henry, given his job, built the case against his own father and was lauded as a patriot. In truth, Henry was brutal in delivering his methods and was clearly a psychopath who enjoyed inflicting pain on others. During his recruitment interview, he wants assurances that he'll be protected for the things he does for the service, i.e. torture. He was obsessed with his work, and this is shown through his mind world, which depicts a cluttered environment featuring filing cabinets and paperwork everywhere. At some point though, Henry was given a job and assigned to a case called the Gemini case. It looks like Thomas's actions and what happened to Richard had caught the attention of the security service. You see, Richard had scans done, and the scans revealed no brain trauma despite his vegetative state. Given that this mirrors what Thomas did to the scientists years earlier, they assigned Henry Wilk to go to the NIWA Resort and investigate. They gave Henry access to scientists' notes from the experimentation suffered by Thomas and details of his power. Henry arrived and got to work. He initially asked Lilianne questions about Thomas, but she refused to tell him a thing. Then Henry got desperate. Thomas found out exactly who Henry was and why he was there, leading to the scene that we saw in the garage. Okay, so we'll pick up on Lilianne's story now. The game of course led us to believe that Lilianne, or rather Sadness, was a victim of the NIWA massacre, a spirit left behind in the hotel, unable to move on. We obviously know that that isn't the case. As we've discussed, Lilianne was a young girl when her mother gave birth to Marianne. As also mentioned, it's not confirmed that Marianne's birth was the cause of their mother's death, but Lilianne seems to point at it being Marianne's fault that their mother was taken away from her. Also from a young age, Lilianne had certain abilities, as she was a very powerful medium, likely inheriting it from her father. Then along came Richard, who abused her, and the trauma from that, along with the anger, awoke something deep inside her. Her soul essentially split in two. This was also what happened to Richard and Henry's souls. She would hear a voice which would talk to her. This led to other children at the resort laughing at her and branding her a freak for talking to herself when, in fact, she was conversing with a spirit inside her. This voice would become a friend to Lilianne during this time, reassuring her that it understands her. This spirit was the Moor. Then Henry would come along and set fire to the house with them inside. Given that Lilianne did harbour some ill feeling towards her sister, the Moor inside Lilianne urged her to leave her to burn in the fire, but Lilianne stood up for her sister. She made a deal with the Moor that if the entity could save them both, she would set it free. Even though the Moor saved 3-year-old Marianne, she was in a bad way. The burns to her body covered 45% of her body, and she'd suffered smoke inhalation. She would remain in a coma until they could rule out carbon monoxide poisoning, and when she came round she had amnesia and remembered absolutely nothing. Thomas made the difficult decision to abandon her there at the hospital in order to protect her. She would be committed to an orphanage, but even though Marianne had no knowledge of her past life, she wouldn't escape the powers that she herself had inherited from her father. She realised from a young age that she had a gift, and she even helped a young boy named Matthew pass on in peace. She would float between foster homes during her youth, but she would eventually come to be taken in and raised permanently by Jack Orkan, a funeral director living in Krakow. She got Jack and herself in a spot of bother some years later though, as a letter from her school to Jack reveals that she gave a fellow student a message from his recently deceased grandmother. Despite the fact that this happened, Jack still saw Marianne's abilities as a medium as a gift and not a curse, and she credits him as the one who helped her accept her gift. Marianne's powers materialised a little bit differently to those of her father and sister. You'll have noticed that both Thomas and Lilianne were able to exist across two worlds as separate personalities that could move independently, but who were still linked via a spirit and body connection. Marianne, on the other hand, could only exist in both worlds as one person, and her spiritual movements would completely mirror her physical ones. She would help Jack to run his funeral home business up until the day Jack died. It does seem that prior to Jack's death, he was scheduled for an operation, and upon talking to him in the spiritual realm, Jack's spirit tells Marianne that he's worried about the operation. This suggests to me that Jack may have died whilst waiting for a potentially life-saving operation, and judging from the hole in Jack's head, it may have been that he was due to see a neurosurgeon to remove a brain tumour. But now we move on to the big bad wolf. Let's discuss the Moor. So as mentioned, the Moor was the other part of Lilianne's split soul. This entity is evil. This entity thrives via possession of a physical body, and it has a real thirst for death. The way the Moor described what it does is that it wears people's skin, using their bodies as vessels. But let's see what that means for this story. You'll recall that after Thomas asked Lilianne about the fire, that she heard a voice that she didn't invite. Thomas used the bunker underneath the family home to quarantine Lilianne. Scared that she would lose control of her powers, he started researching ways to manage it. He found a book on suppressing the supernatural. He discovered that salt, or rather sodium chloride, was an effective way of suppressing supernatural power, which is why Marianne finds salt on Thomas's desk in his office. He lined Lilianne's room in the bunker with salt, and this meant that the room that Lilianne was living in inside the bunker existed in the material world, but didn't exist in the spiritual world. But the Moor wasn't happy at all. It needed to feed, and it wanted out. And very soon, it got out. You see, NIWA had a jolly old groundskeeper called Francis, or Frank. We can see Frank's journey throughout his time at NIWA. He writes to his wife, saying that he wishes she could be there with him, etc. Except Frank never sent a single postcard. He just kept them. The resort is brimming and lots of families are staying there having a great time. Frank even got promoted to be the chief of staff for the hotel. But then something happened to Frank. He discovered how Lilianne was being kept in the bunker by Thomas. Now this caused great conflict inside Frank until one day he couldn't take it anymore. He went down to the bunker and let Lilianne out. Frank then realised he'd made a huge mistake, because not only did he let Lilianne out, but also something else too. The Moor, and it was hungry. Lilianne was then chased down by her father, and the dream scene by the lake takes place. But of course, Thomas didn't actually shoot Lilianne like Marianne dreamt. The Moor then entered into the NIWA hotel and possessed the nurse, Ursula. Ursula, under the demonic influence of the Moor, would go on to commit and carry out the NIWA massacre. She slaughtered many people, starting with Richard. Ursula was described by the chief inspector himself as almost seeming to be possessed. Naturally, the Moor soon outgrew Ursula and was on the hunt for a new vessel. It's extremely likely that the Moor possessed Frank at this point. During Marianne's encounter with the Moor in the forest, the demon speaks of how it wore Frank at one point.
Francis, I wore you, but then I outgrew him.
It's unclear exactly how long Frank was possessed by the Moor, but he hints at possession being likely through his writings. In this one, he states, "Why won't it stop talking?" Frank is obviously hearing the Moor talking to him. He also writes on a postcard showing us that he potentially enjoyed the NIWA massacre. But again, the Moor needed yet another vessel. Frank obviously passed away, leading to Marianne finding him and his dog, who had been living at Frank's camp in the forest. The Moor then obviously wanted Marianne, and again, during the scene at Frank's campsite, the Moor says that nothing fits anymore. You see, the Moor possessing people isn't ever a permanent thing. It cannot exist for long in the material world, so it needs to reside inside a vessel or a host. Problem is that the host body degrades over time. The Moor tried at various points to possess deer in the forest, but this was unsuccessful. Marianne comes across 3 deer carcasses that look as if they've been burned from the inside out. This is because they weren't suitable vessels. This is why the Moor chases Marianne and hunts her with such ferocity. It needs her. During chases, the spirit says that it wants to wear her skin, and the Moor groans when Marianne tries to outrun it. Alright, so to finish this video off, we'll quickly look at symbolism in the game. The main thing we should talk about are the masks. Why not their normal faces? I believe that this spiritual world taps into a custom that the Egyptians carried out. The Egyptians were certain that burying someone with a death mask on would allow the spirit of the deceased to find his or her body in the afterlife. This is why Marianne needs to present them with masks in order for them to successfully pass on. These people are essentially stuck in purgatory. There's also the 2 cat statues that Marianne obtains. The cats may also signify a connection here, as the Egyptians believe that cats hold within them divine energy. But that's it for this video. I hope this one did a good job of unraveling and untangling various parts of the story. Overall, I enjoyed this game. I did put off playing it for a while, but if you haven't played it, I'd recommend it. Please leave a like and subscribe if you enjoyed this one, and leave a comment with your thoughts down below. But for now, take care, and I'll see you in the next one.